41 men. That's how many had tried to put the harbor fighter on the ground before that morning in 1968. 41. Dock workers, sailors off the boats, 2 off-duty cops who'd had enough of him, a wrestler who came up from the south specifically to do it. 41 men who looked at this man and decided they were the one who'd finally bring him down. He buried all 41. Not metaphorically. Some of those men never worked the docks again. One of them, I was told, still ate through a straw 11 years later. The harbor fighter didn't lose. He didn't draw. He didn't have close calls. He had 41 men and 41 endings, and not one of those endings belonged to the other guy. So when he stepped onto that wet dock in front of Bruce Lee, the men watching weren't wondering if Bruce would win. They were wondering how bad it was going to be for the small one. And then it took 50 seconds. 50. The man who'd ended 41 fights was on the planks in the rain, and the small one hadn't even changed his breathing. That should be the whole story, bro. That should be where I close the file and pour you a drink and tell you that's what discipline does to brute force. 41 wins, 1 stranger, 50 seconds, the end. But it isn't the end. Because that man got up off those planks. And years later, he came back to that same harbor. The same dock. The rain again, like the place only knew one kind of weather. And every man in that crowd who remembered 68 thought the same thing. He's come back for revenge. They were wrong. All of them. They were so wrong it took me years to understand how wrong, and I only understood it because there was one man standing on that dock both times, the day he lost and the day he returned, and that man had a camera. So stick with me all the way to the end on this one. Don't drift off halfway. Because what the harbor fighter came back for was not what a single soul in that crowd assumed. What looked like a man returning to settle a score was something else entirely. Something quieter. Something that turns the whole night in 1968 inside out and makes you wonder if anybody there, Bruce included, ever really understood who they'd been standing across from. Pull the chair in. Pour something warm. Let me tell you about the harbor. You remember the man with the camera. If you've been sitting in this gym with me a while, you do. The photographer. The young one with the cheap suit and the one good lens. The one who was standing in the wrong corner of the wrong hall the first time I told you a harbor story. He never set out to spend his life chasing this. Nobody does. You take one photograph that you can't explain, and it gets a hook into you, and 40 years later you're an old man with a metal box full of negatives and a story you've never told straight to anybody. He told it to me. And the reason I trust him, the reason I'm going to ask you to trust him, is that he had no stake in the legend. He didn't train. He didn't fight. He didn't worship Bruce Lee. He was a working man with a camera who got sent down to the harbor in the spring of 1968 to shoot a labor dispute for a paper that doesn't exist anymore, and he ended up pointing his lens at the only thing on that dock worth pointing it at. I've spent a long time around men who lose fights, bro. That's half my life, if I'm honest. You think a coach's job is the winning. It isn't. Anybody can stand next to a winner. The job is the other thing. The locker room after, the long quiet drive. The man who has to figure out who he is now that the thing he was sure of turned out to be wrong. I know where defeat sends a man. I know the bottle it points him at, the resentment it grows in him, The way it can hollow out somebody who used to be solid all the way through. So when the photographer told me where this defeat sent the harbor fighter, I didn't believe him. I'm telling you that flat, so you don't think I'm an easy sell. I sat across from that old man and I thought, no, that's not what loss does. Not to a man who'd built his whole self on 41 wins. You don't take a man like that, break him in front of the only world he's got, and have him come back years later for the reason you're describing. That's not how men work. I was wrong. He was right, and the camera proved it. But I'm getting ahead of the rain. Let me put you back in 1968 first, on the morning it started, because to understand why the harbor fighter came back, you have to understand exactly how, and why, he went down the first time. And it didn't start with a challenge. It started with a trap. The trap was simple, the way the good ones always are. Bruce wasn't supposed to be at the harbor that morning. He had no business there. There was a man he was meeting, an importer, a dealer in the kind of training equipment you couldn't get easily back then, heavy bags and the old iron, the stuff that came off the boats. The meeting was real. The man was real. That's what made it work. You don't lure someone with a lie if the truth will carry them to the same dock. What Bruce didn't know was that the importer owed money. And the man he owed it to ran a piece of that harbor the way certain men ran certain pieces of every city in those years. Not on paper, but on the understanding that crosses a working man's mind when he sees who's standing at the end of the pier. And that man, the one who was owed, had a problem with his own reputation. Word had gotten around the docks that there was a Chinese kid teaching fighting up in the city, teaching it to anybody, white men, black men, women, anybody with the money and the will, and that kind of word travels strange among certain men. It curdles in them. They take it personal in a way that has nothing to do with anything that was ever done to them. So when the importer came begging for time on his debt, the man who was owed offered him a deal. Bring the kid to the harbor. We'll handle the rest. Your debt's clean. And here's the part one want you to sit with, because it's where the whole thing already starts to bend away from what the crowd would later believe. The man who was owed didn't plan to fight Bruce himself. He wasn't a fighter. He was a man who paid for fighting. And the man he kept on the docks for exactly this kind of work. The man he sent down to those wet planks that morning. Was the harbor fighter. 41 wins. The man who ate through a straw. The wrestler from the South who came up special and went home different. That man worked for the man who was owed. He was, in the plainest language I can give you, a weapon that somebody else owned. You pointed him, and he went off, and afterward you put him back in the drawer. Remember that? Owned. We're coming back to it, and when we do it's going to change the color of everything you thought you saw. So the morning comes, spring of 1968. And the harbor that day smelled the way the photographer described it to me 3 different times, because some smells get into a man and never wash out. Wet rope, diesel, the iron rust of the cranes, and under all of it the cold green rot of the water slapping the pilings. Rain coming. Not falling yet, but coming, the whole sky the color of an old nickel. Bruce walks down to meet the importer. The importer is there, and the importer can't look at him. That's the first wrong note, and Bruce, the photographer, swears to this, and I believe it, because it fits everything I know about how the man read a room. Bruce caught it instantly. the importer's eyes going everywhere except to the face of the man he came to meet. A man who won't look at you is a man who has already sold you. Bruce knew that walking in. He kept walking anyway. And the dock filled up. Not fast. That's the thing about a trap like this. It tightens slow, so that by the time you understand the shape of it, you're already inside. Dock workers drifting over with their hands in their jackets. The man who was owed, up on a stack of crates where he could watch without being part of it. And from the far end of the pier, taking his time, in no hurry at all, because hurry was for men who weren't sure how the morning would end. The harbor fighter. The photographer raised his camera out of pure instinct. He didn't know what he was looking at yet. He just knew the way the crowd had the way working men with cameras learn to know, that something was about to be worth a frame. Gone quiet, and the way the small man in the middle of it hadn't moved an inch, and he knew. Let me tell you what he saw through that lens. Because this is where the legend and the truth start walking different roads, and I want you on the right one. Through the lens, he saw a mismatch that didn't make sense. The harbor fighter was a wall of a man. Not tall the way you picture, wide. Built low and thick, the way the genuinely dangerous ones often are, with hands that had broken on other men's faces so many times the knuckles had gone flat and wrong. He carried his weight forward, on the balls of his feet, and the photographer said you could see it even standing still, that this was a man who had never once in his life been afraid of walking towards something. And across from him, Bruce, 130-odd pounds in a thin jacket against the cold off the water. Still, hands not even up yet. Just looking. Now here's what the crowd read in that picture, and here's what they were dead certain of as they stood there in the salt air. They read it the way you'd read it. Big man, small man. Owned weapon, lured stranger. 41 graves on one side, and a kid who taught classes on the other. Every man on that dock had already written the ending, and the ending was ugly, and most of them, if I'm honest about the kind of men they were, had come to watch it happen. But the photographer wasn't reading the crowd. He was reading the frame. And in the frame, something was wrong with the wrong man. It was the harbor fighter who wouldn't settle. You'd expect the still one, the calm one, to be Bruce, and he was, that part's true. But the photographer kept his eye to the glass, and he watched the big man's weight shift. Once, then back. A man with 41 wins does not adjust his feet in front of victory number 42. He plants. He comes. But this man was reading something off the small stranger that the crowd couldn't see, and it was making him recalculate, and the recalculating was making him late. I know that feeling, bro. I've stood across from men in a ring and felt the floor tilt under a certainty I walked in with. Your body knows before your pride will let your head admit it. The harbor fighter's body already knew. His pride sent him forward anyway. It almost always does. And here is the 50 seconds. I'm not going to dress it up for you, because the dressing up is what the legend did, and the legend got it wrong. There was no flying, no magic, no untouchable blur of a man dancing circles around a brute. What there was worse than that, and quieter than that, and the photographer caught the middle of it in a single frame that he has never sold to anyone, that he showed to me across a kitchen table with hands that still weren't entirely steady 40 years on. The harbor fighter came. He came the way he'd come at 41 men, low and forward, all that flat-knuckled weight behind it, a thing you do not stop, you only get out of the way of, and most men can't even do that in time. Bruce didn't get out of the way. He got inside it. He stepped into the one place on the dock the big man's power couldn't reach. Close, too close, closer than the punch was built for, and he did 3 things so fast the photographer only understood them later, frame by frame, in a dark room, in the red light, alone. A hand that turned the big man's own weight against him. A heel that took the platform out from under that forward lean. And a single strike, short, no wind-up, no theater, into a place on the body that does not care how many men you buried. The harbor fighter went down on the wet planks. And he didn't get up fighting. He got up stopped. There's a difference, and any man who's been genuinely beaten, not outpointed, not tired out, but beaten, shown the floor of what he is, knows the difference in his own bones. He got to one knee in the rain that had finally started to fall, and he stayed there, and he looked up at the small man standing over him. And Bruce did not finish it. That's the part the crowd remembered. That's the part that became the legend, the mercy, the open hand, the small man choosing not to take the last thing he could have taken. And it's true, he didn't finish it. But the legend put the meaning in the wrong place. The legend said Bruce spared him out of honor, out of philosophy, out of some lesson about the emptiness of cruelty. The photographer was close enough to see Bruce's face, and he told me it wasn't mercy. It was recognition. Bruce was looking down at that kneeling man like he'd just understood something about him that the man himself didn't know yet. Like the fight had told Bruce a secret. And whatever that secret was, it took the appetite for the ending clean out of him. Bruce said one thing. Quiet. The photographer only caught it because the whole dock had gone silent the way a place goes silent when it's just watched its own certainty die. For words, down to a man on one knee in the rain. And those 4 words are the reason he came back. I'll tell you what they were. But first, I have to tell you what nobody on that dock knew about the harbor fighter, about who owned him, and what it actually means to be a weapon in another man's drawer. Because that, bro, is the thing that turns this whole story inside out. Here's the part most people get wrong. When a man belongs to somebody, and I mean belongs, the way the harbor fighter belonged to the man who was owed, you make an assumption about him without ever deciding to. You assume he chose it. You assume that somewhere back along the line he looked at the work and said, yes, this is who I'll be, the fist somebody else points. And so when he falls, you don't waste any pity on him. He earned the floor. He'd have earned you the floor too, if the morning had gone the other way. That's what the crowd assumed about the man on one knee in the rain. And I'll be honest with you, it's what I assumed, sitting at that kitchen table, before the old photographer set me straight. He didn't choose it. He was born into it. The man who owned the harbor fighter had owned his father before him. Same docks. Same arrangement. A debt that never quite got paid, that got passed down like a bad name. The boy grew up watching his father be the fist, and grew up understanding, the way children understand the weather, that this was simply the shape of the world and there was no door out of it. By the time he was big enough to throw the punch himself, nobody had to ask him twice. There was nothing to choose. There was only the next man at the end of the pier. 41 wins, bro. You hear it now, don't you? Those weren't 41 victories. Those were 41 mornings a man went down to the water and did the only thing he'd ever been allowed to be, because the alternative was a debt that wasn't his coming due on the only family he had left. Now look back at that fight with me. Same dock. Same rain. Different meaning. Bruce didn't beat a monster that morning. He beat a man who'd never once in his life been asked what he wanted. And here's the thing the photographer saw in Bruce's face and called recognition. I think Bruce understood it in the fight itself. You can't touch a man that closely, can't feel the way his power comes off him, without learning something true about him. And what Bruce felt, I'd bet my gym on it, was that the violence had no joy in it. No appetite. It was a man doing a job he'd been doing since before he had words for it. There's a particular emptiness to that, and a fighter as fine as Bruce would have felt it like a cold spot in the room. That's why he didn't finish it. Not mercy. Not philosophy. Recognition. He looked down and saw a man who'd been losing his whole life even on the mornings he won. And the 4 words. Here they are. Bruce leaned down in the rain, with the whole dock holding its breath, and he said, "You don't have to." That's all. 4 words. You don't have to. He wasn't talking about the fight. The fight was over. He was talking about everything the fight had been standing in for. The next man at the end of the pier, and the man after that, and the whole inherited shape of a life that some other man owned outright. The harbor fighter didn't answer. He got up, and he walked off down the pier into the rain, and the crowd parted for him the way a crowd parts for a beaten man, with that little bit of contempt that's really just relief it wasn't them. And that, the legend says, is the end. The small men spared the giant, taught the lesson, walked away. Fade out. But I told you at the start, it isn't the end. Because 4 words got into that man the way a smell gets into you and never washes out. And it took him years of going back to the only work he knew, years of the man who owned him pointing him at the next one and the one after, before those 4 words finished doing what they'd started. You don't have to. So let me bring you to the second time the photographer stood on that dock. Older. The light different. The rain, of course, the same. And the harbor fighter walking back up the pier toward a crowd that took one look at him and thought, every one of them, the same wrong thing. The years in between were the hardest part for me to swallow, so I'll give them to you the way the photographer gave them to me, plain, no softening, because the softening is a lie and you'd smell it. Nothing changed. That's the brutal truth of it. A man hears 4 words on a dock that crack something open in him, and you want the story to go that he walked off and was free by sundown. Life doesn't pay out that fast. The harbor fighter went back to the man who owned him, because where else does a man with one family and an inherited debt go? And he was the fist again the next time the fist was wanted, and the time after that. But something was wrong with the work now. The photographer heard it the way a man hears things over years in a town that isn't as big as it pretends to be. The harbor fighter had lost the thing that made him useful. Not the strength. The strength was still there, terrible as ever. He'd lost the emptiness. And it turns out that the emptiness was the whole job. A weapon that starts asking why is no good to the man holding it. He started, slow at first, finishing fights late, then not finishing them at all. Then one morning, the photographer was told, a man was sent down to the end of the pier the way men always were, and the harbor fighter looked at him for a long moment and simply walked away up the dock, and left the man standing there, alive and confused, and left the dead standing too. You can guess what that costs a man who's owned. The man who owned him didn't kill him. That's not how those men worked. And besides, a dead weapon settles nothing. He did something colder. He called the debt. The whole of it, the fathers and the sons, all of it at once, knowing it could never be paid, knowing exactly what it would do. He took the docks away. Took the work, the only work the man had. Put the word out, the way that kind of man can, so that no boat and no crew on that water would take him. He didn't end the harbor fighter's life. He just removed every place in it where the man could stand. And here's the thing, bro. The harbor fighter let him. He let the debt land. He let the work go. He let himself be turned out of the only world he'd ever been allowed into. Because somewhere in those years the 4 words had finished their work, and the man had understood the thing Bruce had seen in him on the dock, that the life he was losing had never been his to begin with. You can't lose what was always somebody else's. The man who owned him thought he was destroying him. He was setting him down. So now you've got the years. Now we can stand on the dock the second time. It's later. The photographer is older, gone a little gray, still working, still carrying the one good lens. He's down at the harbor on some other story entirely, and he sees the crowd start to gather the old way. That tightening, that quiet, and he feels it in his chest before his eyes even find the reason, a cold drop of it, because there's only one thing that ever made this dock go quiet like that. And up the pier, taking his time, in no hurry at all, comes the harbor fighter. Older now, too. Heavier and slower, the flat knuckles, the low forward weight. And every man on that dock who'd been there in '68, or who'd heard the story from someone who had, and that was most of them, read it the only way it could be read. He's come back for revenge. Of course he has. What else does a beaten man come back to a dock for? He's lost the work, lost the standing, lost the place, and somewhere out there in the city the small man who started it all by leaning down in the rain and saying 4 words, that small man is still being talked about, still being a legend, while the harbor fighter is a turnout man walking up a pier in the cold. The crowd wrote the ending again. They always do. Big man, old grievance. One thing left to settle. The man who owned him was there too. Up on the crates, same as before, older, watching to see his discarded weapon prove him right. Prove it had only ever been a thing that breaks other things, and that taking the dock away had been the correct and necessary act. The harbor fighter walked up the pier through the parting crowd. Past the man who owned him, without a glance, and the photographer said that was the first wrong note, because a man coming for revenge looks at the man who wronged him, and this man's eyes went right over him like he wasn't on the crates at all. He walked to the very end, to the wet planks where it had happened, to the exact place, the photographer swore, where Bruce had stood, and he stopped, and he turned around to face the crowd that had come to watch him take his revenge. And the photographer, old hands and all, lifted the lens, because whatever was about to happen, he'd missed nothing the first time, and he wasn't going to miss it now. What the harbor fighter had come back to that dock to do, I'll tell you. And I promise you it lands cleaner than any revenge ever could. He came back to give the 4 words away. That's it. That's the whole of it. And I know how small that sounds against everything the crowd had braced for. But you sit with it a second and it gets bigger than any beating could. There was a man at that harbor, young, The photographer figured him for early 20s, no more. And this young man was the next one. You understand what I mean by now. He was being raised into it the same way the harbor fighter had been raised into it, and the harbor fighter's father before him. The man who owned the docks never let a good fist go to waste, and a weapon, once you've lost one, you replace. The young man had a debt he'd been born holding. He had the low forward weight already, the beginning of the flat knuckles. He had the emptiness, that cold spot Bruce would have felt across the dock, already settling into him, because he'd been told his whole short life that this was simply the shape of the world and there was no door out of it. And the harbor fighter had found out. Word travels strange among certain men, you remember? The same way it had once curdled in the man who was owed news of a Chinese kid teaching anybody. That same kind of word had reached the harbor fighter out there in his turned-out life, that there was a boy on the docks now being made into what he had been. So he came back. Not for the man who owned him. That's why his eyes went right over the crates. You don't waste your reckoning on the man holding the leash. The leash isn't the point. He came back to the end of the pier, to the exact wet planks where a small stranger had once leaned down to him in the rain, because he had finally understood that he'd been carrying something all those years that wasn't his to keep. It had been given to him. And a thing that's given to you, you don't own it either. You pass it on, or it dies with you. He turned to face the crowd, and they tensed, every one of them. And then he found the young man's face among them. And he did the only thing he'd come to do. He walked over, slow, the crowd flinching back from him the whole way, certain now this was where the violence finally started, and he stopped in front of the boy who was being made into him. And the photographer was close as he'd been the first time, close enough to catch the one frame and close enough to hear it. The harbor fighter leaned down. Same lean. Rain coming off both of them. And he said, "You don't have to." Same 4 words. Handed down the pier from a small man in 1968 to a giant in the rain, to a boy who'd never been asked what he wanted either. The same cold spot, the same inherited debt, the same world that swore there was no door, and the same 4 words walking straight through the wall of it like the wall was never really there. That's what he came back for. Not to take a beating off the books. To take a boy off the same road he'd spent 41 mornings walking, before anybody finished making him into a man who couldn't get off it. And the man on the crates? The man who owned the docks, who'd called the whole debt and turned the harbor fighter out into the cold to break him. That man watched his discarded weapon walk up his own pier and quietly, with 4 words, take the next weapon out of his hands. There's nothing he could do about it that wouldn't have made it worse. You can break a fist. You can't break a thing a man hands freely to a boy. It's already out of the room. It's already gone down the pier and into somebody who'll carry it further than you can reach. The young man didn't fight that morning. There was no fight to have. He looked up at the giant who'd come all that way to tell him the one thing nobody on those docks had ever been allowed to say out loud, and whatever was in his face, the photographer didn't catch it, because his eye was full of tears by then, and he let the camera down. Said it was the only frame in 50 years of working he was glad he missed. Some things you don't put behind glass. You just stand there in the rain and let them happen to you. The harbor fighter walked back down the pier and off the docks and out of the story, and nobody the photographer ever talked to saw him again. He didn't need the dock anymore. He'd come back to put something down, and he put it down, and a man who's finally set down the thing he was born carrying doesn't have any more business at the water. So here's what I want you to take from it, bro, and then I'll let you go. The legend told it like the meaning was in the 50 seconds, the small man, the giant, the flying, the magic. And the 50 seconds were real, and they were beautiful, and I'd have given a year of my life to see them. But the meaning was never in the 50 seconds. The meaning was in 4 words, said quiet, in the rain, by a man who understood that the strongest thing you can ever do to another person isn't put them on the floor. It's lean down and look them in the eye and tell them they don't have to be the thing the world made them. That's the whole story. That's why he came back.